Hey everybody, Trey here, back with yet another forecast discussion as we have another severe weather event on tap for many of the same areas that saw severe weather the last couple of days with our previous system. Another system set to move in, this one perhaps bring a little bit more favorable characteristics with it for a robust tornado event. We'll get into that here in just a second. But for now, we have a slight risk level 2 out of 5 for Thursday, and this is mostly going to be Thursday evening to the nighttime hours going into Friday morning, this particular outlook. So most of the day, Thursday is going to remain severe weather free, but once we get into the evening and nighttime hours, we will start to see an uptick in activity that could be severe, and that is what this is for. Slight risk level 2 out of 5 from East Texas into the ArkLaTex, southern Arkansas, northern half of Louisiana into the Mississippi River Delta in far western Mississippi. All hazards associated with this activity are possible. 5% tornado risk within that slight risk area, extending all the way into western Mississippi. Damaging wind and large hail, a possibility as well. Then we go into the crux of the event. The threat will continue and increase going into Friday, January 12th. We have an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 from parts of southeast Alabama in through Georgia and the Carolinas, surrounded by a large slight risk around that. This is when the intensity of the trough is going to increase. The geometry of the trough is going to be more favorable for significant severe weather. And as I said before, this system is looking like it's going to be more of a possibility to produce more widespread discrete supercells, which, as we know, are more favorable for strong long track tornadoes. So we're going to have to monitor that as well. Day 3 outlook has that 30% hashed area up from southern Alabama in through the Carolinas there for significant severe weather on tap for that day. Now, I wasn't going to do a video today on this setup. I was going to wait until Thursday, but I'm going to be doing some traveling the next couple of days back to Oklahoma. So I will be probably unable to do a video tomorrow, which is when I'd normally put out a video for this event. So I wanted to at least get up early today before I leave and head out here back to Oklahoma, and just at least get a video out for you guys so you know some of the overall threats that are at play with this particular setup, as it is looking to be possibly a little bit more robust. Not the overall parameters at play, but the overall threats that we might see could be a little bit more robust than what we saw with our previous event the last couple of days, which was potent in and of itself, but this one aligned a little bit better possibly for a more robust tornado threat, a significant tornado threat especially. So let's go ahead and dive into our upper air maps here. This is our current 500 millibar map from the SPC mesoanalysis page. Here is our old trough here that produced all that severe weather from East Texas into the southeast states, into the eastern seaboard yesterday. Lots of damaging wind, lots of severe thunderstorm warnings with 70, 80 plus mile an hour wind tags on them, as well as some tornadoes. Thankfully, we did not see that ceiling kind of tornado threat come to fruition, although we did have quite a few tornadoes across the Florida Panhandle, southern Georgia yesterday as the squall line moved east, and with significant discrete activity that moved inland across the Florida Panhandle yesterday morning. And we also saw a lot of supercells offshore yesterday. Thankfully, they stayed offshore. I'll be doing a video about this event. I'm going to wait until I get back into Oklahoma, and once we see the progression of this upcoming event, we'll probably do a video breaking down the last couple days as well as the next couple of days, and kind of compare and contrast the two events and what happened. But there is our old trough moving out pretty quickly there, being replaced by this new trough back here. You're starting to see a little bit of some kinks in the height contours there across the Pacific Northwest, a little bit of a belt of strong flow starting to creep into the top left portion of your screen there. That is our next trough. That is going to start digging down pretty rapidly here over the next day or so, and really make its way very quickly into the southern portion of the U.S., ejecting into the southern plains and southeast tomorrow evening into Friday. So that is going to be our main player. We'll take a look at some model data here in just a second. But here is our 850 millibar map currently. You see just a little bit of troughing here centered across the entirety of the plains. Cyclone center up here across far southern Canada. That will probably move off to the east. We do have a bit, as we saw, some of that just in between these two troughs. There's just some zonal westerly flow here across the country. Still strong, so it is helping to induce a little bit of lee cyclogenesis here across much of the plains. But again, that should be replaced by a much stronger low as we go, a low-level cyclone as we go into the day into the nighttime hours on Thursday, and especially into the day on Friday. The low is really going to tighten up with this system, and we'll again see that in just a second. Surface pattern here, not much to see at this point. Much of the same as the 850 millibar map, a little bit of a surface low center up there in far southern Canada. Just some broad surface troughing out here across much of the plains. Nothing really of note yet. We haven't seen significant development here in the southern plains, which we will see going into Thursday evening. And that is going to need to happen in order to bring that moisture northward into these areas. As you know, we had a big cold front associated with the system the last couple of days. That has again swept those dew points out, that robust moisture out into the Gulf. You see across Texas right now, dew points in the 20s and 30s here. So very cool, dry air replacing what was warm, moist air in the warm sector of that cyclone for the last couple of days, Monday and Tuesday. But that's not the case right now, as we have had that cold front sweep those dew points out into the Gulf. Moving off to the east, much of the same here. You do see some upper 50s dew points there in far south Florida, just the very southern tip of the moisture plume, but the rest of the area here across the southeast, very cool, dry air. Dew points in the 20s and 30s out here across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, into the Florida panhandle. So very cool, dry air, but again, the kinematics associated with this next system are going to be very robust, especially surface low development across the southern plains moving into the Midwest, and that will allow for robust moisture return into the inland areas. Now, how far north that goes is still in question and maybe a limiting factor with this particular event. But let's go into some model data for this event. We're just going to be looking at the 12Z NAM that is coming in as we speak, as I'm recording this video. So a lot of the models are on the same page with the progression of the features with this event. So I'm just going to look at the 12Z NAM in the sake of saving time here, and we should get a good picture of what is expected to happen and the possible outcomes with this setup. We'll start off at 500 millibars, as we always do. And here is our current trough, so to speak, that will again quickly be moving out of here, being replaced by this next trough you see digging down into the desert southwest, ejecting into the southern plains, taking on a much more neutral tilt as we go into the nighttime hours on Thursday, morning hours on Friday, and as it ejects into the southeast, it'll take on an even more negative tilt, which, as we've talked about before, is often more favorable for significant severe weather. Not always, but in a lot of cases, you'll see your more robust tornado events occur with more negatively tilted troughs. Now, one of the reasons I mentioned before, as we know, that this upcoming event may be a little bit more robust as far as discrete tornadic supercells goes, is the overall geometry of the trough. Now, if we compare it to our trough from the last couple of days, you'll see a lot of differences right away. So this is our current NAM model run, progging out ahead a couple of days to Friday, about noon Central Time on Friday, 18Z on Friday. Now let's take a look at the 12Z NAM from yesterday, January 9th, showing the initialization of our trough that provided the severe weather event for the last couple of days. And you'll see a lot of differences right off the bat. So here's our current trough, or here's our forecast trough for Friday. Here is our trough from the last couple of days. Right away, you see a couple of differences. Number one, this trough is a lot more high amplitude and has a lot more meridional flow in the exit region of the trough. Meridional just means oriented from south to north. And in contrast, the upcoming trough has much more of a zonal flow component here in the exit region of the trough. Zonal just means more west to east. Now, not always the case, but oftentimes this will lead to a much more favorable orientation of shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. So you'll have your dry line or cold front or whatever, and your shear vectors will, as we know, we want them to be oriented more perpendicularly to that initiating boundary in order to provide a better chance for discrete convection. When those are oriented more along or parallel to the initiating boundary, that tends to lead to very quick transition to a squall line, which we saw on our previous event the last couple of days. We also did see discrete development well out ahead of the initiating boundary, but these types of setups are always what I look for in the southeast when I'm deciding whether or not to chase in the southeast. That oftentimes is a deciding factor. The geometry of the trough, how much zonal flow component of the flow in the exit region is more zonal compared to more meridional. And you'll see right here, right away, we had a very big difference between these two troughs. Very meridional flow in the exit region of this trough, and as such, we had our cold front as our initiating boundary. Those shear vectors were oriented right along that initiating boundary. Therefore, really the main severe weather threat with this setup came from that squall line. We did have, again, a little bit of discrete activity out ahead of that squall line, but that squall line was our really our main, most notable feature for producing severe weather in the event the last couple days. Now, with this event upcoming, that doesn't seem to be as much of the case. Now, we still have very strong forcing associated with this trough, but given that we have a little bit better flow orientation in the exit region of the trough with respect to our initiating boundaries, that may be a little bit better chance to sustain longer track discrete supercells in this environment. So that is one reason. Again, the negative tilt of this upcoming trough and the lower amplitude nature of this trough, I think, are going to be pretty favorable for maintaining discrete supercells. Now, there are plenty of flies in the ointment. We'll go over those here in a second. But the geometry of this trough looks to be much more favorable for sustaining discrete supercells, a discrete storm mode, than what we saw the last couple of days. I mean, this is a classic looking trough for southeast tornado outbreaks. We see this very much lower amplitude feature. The jet streak here, negatively tilted as far as its axis goes. Jet streak just kind of giving a glancing blow here to the southeast with more zonal flow in the exit region. That is often much more favorable for maintaining discrete development. And I hate to compare any event to April 27, 2011, but just to give you an example that oftentimes this kind of trough orientation can lead to some pretty nasty things in the southeast. Let's pull up the 500 millibar map from April 27, 2011. Of course, again, I want to preface this by saying I am not saying in any stretch of the imagination that that the Thursday-Friday event will be in the same universe as April 27, 2011. I'm just showing you that the upper level trough, oriented in this type of a fashion, this negative tilt, lower amplitude type of shortwave type feature, is often more favorable for robust outbreaks in the southeast. So here we are, 21Z on April 27, 2011. Outbreak was well underway by this point. You can see much of the same. Jet streak rounding the base of the trough, stronger flow rounding the base of that trough, taking on a much more negative tilt there, and moving right into the southeast, kind of a glancing blow here across central and Mississippi and Alabama, right where most of those tornadoes occurred. And that looks pretty similar to what we are seeing for our Friday event. Now, again, not in the same universe as far as parameters go, but still we should note that this trough looks pretty favorable for a more sustenance of discrete supercells here than our event the last couple of days. So as we go forward, that trough will continue to eject into the eastern seaboard states, kind of occlude in general, and then we'll see our severe threat move out pretty quickly going into Friday night, Saturday morning. So let's go down to 850 millibars, see what our low-level cyclone is expected to do. Again, we have just broad troughing here across the plains at this point. Not much to speak of. That will move off to the east, and that will be replaced by, again, significant lee cyclogenesis here, probably somewhere in southeast Colorado, western Kansas vicinity by Thursday afternoon into Thursday evening. You see that cyclone developing here. This is at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Thursday evening. So, a low-level cyclone here at 850 millibars centered across southern Kansas. Strong belt of flow out ahead of that, indicating a pretty intense low-level jet developing as we go into the nighttime hours on Friday. That low should continue to strengthen as the trough continues to eject off to the east, and you see very strong flow in the out ahead of that low-level cyclone there, providing very intense low-level wind fields, just like we saw for the event the last couple of days. Very intense low-level wind fields, and that is not going to be different with this particular setup. You can see that some of the blues there, again, 90-plus knots of flow here at 850 millibars. That is, you don't see that very often at all. We thought our last event had pretty intense kinematics, and those were really off the charts, so you don't see that often at all. These might be just slightly less, but very much comparable to what we saw on our Monday-Tuesday event. Very strong low-level flow here going into the day on Friday. That should help sustain any convection from the night before in probably what will be a squall line moving here across Mississippi and Alabama. And we also could see discrete development out ahead of that squall line here. We'll take a look at that further here in just a second. But very strong low-level flow, strong winds in the upper levels out of the southwest. Wind here, very strong flow here out of the south-southwest at 850 millibars, and our surface flow should be out of the south or southeast, so that is very favorable veering of those winds all the way up through the atmosphere, and that should provide a significant deep layer shear and low-level shear environment for organized severe weather, including supercells with a strong tornado threat, given such strong low-level flow here as the trough ejects off off to the east. Down at the surface, let's take a look at our surface map. There's our current surface low, a very tight pressure gradient associated with this surface low. We saw very strong pressure gradient winds across the southern plains as the low moved off to the east behind the severe storms on Monday, Tuesday, and that is because of the very tight pressure gradient associated with this surface low. But cold front now moving into the Atlantic, sweeping our dew points out into the Gulf. We'll start seeing the return of a warm, moist sector as we go into the evening hours on Thursday. Surface low develops here across the Panhandle region, moves to the east pretty quickly, centered across western Oklahoma. That is at 6 p.m. on Thursday evening. That surface low will very much tighten rapidly and efficiently as we go into the day on Friday. Very, very tight, wound up surface low, sub 980 millibars. This could bring some pretty intense weather on its backside and right out ahead of it in its vicinity across the Great Lakes region. Very intense low pressure moving off to the east. You see the pressure gradient here, those isobars extremely close together, indicating strong gradient winds on the back, really all around this surface low. And that will allow for some pretty nasty winter weather up here across the Midwest into the Great Lakes region, as well as the central plains. But very intense surface low. And down to the south, we should see a cold front draped to the south, moving off to the east pretty progressively. And that will be perhaps the initiating boundary for severe convection going into Thursday and Friday. But let's take a closer look at our surface pattern. We'll look at our dew points here. And you see that those blue colors, the 60s and 70s dew points, pretty much off your screen here, swept well into the Gulf thanks to our prior cold frontal intrusion associated with the system on Monday and Tuesday. But as we get that low-level cyclone to develop, that trough starts to eject across the Rockies, we'll see those low-level winds back and strengthen, rapidly pulling that moisture northward. We should have those 60s dew points, that more robust moisture, into southeast Texas, southern Louisiana by about midday on Thursday, and that will continue to stream northward through the day on Thursday. We start to see by about midnight, Thursday going into Friday morning, that we have at least 60s dew points up to the Louisiana-Arkansas border, approaching the ArkLaTex region, 50s dew points farther to the north of that. So given that is why we're going to see the most of the day on Thursday, most of the day and even the evening into Thursday remain storm-free because of the timing of this moisture return and the timing of the ejection of the trough. So this is midnight again on Thursday, early Friday morning. We go back up to 500 millibars, and that is when our trough really starts to eject. We'll start to see the forcing from the trough start to overspread the region, that stronger flow start to overspread the region. Starting on Thursday evening, this is at 3Z on Friday, or on Friday, so 9 p.m. Central Standard Time on Thursday. The forcing starts to overspread the region, and at that point we should start to see storm development along that developing moisture gradient. You can call that a dry line. Cold front still well back here to the north, so you can call that a dry line here, and that should allow for the development of storms probably sometime in the evening to nighttime hours on Thursday. So we will not see for much of the day on Thursday storm development. That will only take place perhaps as far west as the I-35 corridor in Texas along that dry line boundary that's setting up. Cold front still well up here. So our dry line boundary should be our initiating boundary for storms for the late Thursday, Friday morning portion of the event. And given strong forcing aloft, those you should have a lot of updrafts going up on that dry line as the moisture continues to stream northward. They will become surface-based or near surface-based with a potential for an all-hazards threat. And with time, the damaging wind and embedded tornado threat should take over. Now again, we'll have strong forcing here, so we should develop somewhat of a squall line along this dry line that starts to really push off to the east as the cold front kind of catches up to it. So actually, it looks like the actual cold front may still be well back in here, and our dry line stays ahead of it. The SPC was mentioning a prefrontal dry line feature, and that is, I think, what we're seeing here. So we'll have storms developing on the actual dry line, not the cold front. As we go into Friday morning, that should be our main initiating boundary for storms, and they should stay along that prefrontal dry line boundary. So oftentimes when you have a dry line in these southeast setups, that tends to be your a little bit more favorable for robust tornadic supercells. Again, we still have some flies in the ointment. You see how progressive this dry line is. So that will probably lead to more of a squall line along that front, just given the overall forcing along the dry line, the progressive nature of that feature. If we look at our storm mode potential along the dry line, you will see what I was talking about earlier. Dryline oriented more north-south, and our shear vectors are oriented much more perpendicularly to the dry line here. So we very well might see some semblance of more of a broken line perhaps, but we do have strong forcing that might overcome this favorable shear vector orientation for more of a squall line going into Friday morning. But out ahead of that, our dry line feature and any confluence bands in the open warm sector, that should lead, we still maintain that very strong perpendicularity between the shear vectors and the initiating boundary. So that should favor more discrete supercells as the environment becomes more favorable across the southeast states. But going into Friday morning, we should, I think, see more of a squall line, maybe more of a broken line, as we do have those favorable shear vectors, but it does look like we'll see a lot of forcing along that dry line, and then we may see more of a squall line develop going into Friday morning. Take some soundings here across the region. We'll take one from southern Arkansas out ahead just to look at what our environment might be looking like going into Friday morning. This is at 12Z Friday. And again, this is a little bit odd that we have such at least for the Thursday event, such an odd timing for the ejection of the trough. We're not really timing it with the peak diurnal heating. But when you have such strong kinematics, that usually is not much of an issue. So let's look at a couple soundings here, and that is pretty darn favorable up here in southern Arkansas. Instability, not all that deep here. We see it cuts off right there, but we do have all that instability relegated below about 400 millibars or so, which means somewhat lower topped updrafts perhaps, but they will still be pretty efficient in stretching and tilting that low-level shear and vorticity into the vertical, as we have pretty fat cape here, relatively speaking, in the low levels, mid to low levels of the atmosphere. So that means shorter updrafts, but still robust, very robust updrafts, 0 to 3 kilometer cape in excess of 100 joules per kilogram, with about 750 joules per kilogram of mixed layer cape. That is certainly adequate for severe weather, and especially when we have wind profiles looking like this. Strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height here in the low levels of the atmosphere, veering from about southerly at 15 knots at the surface to at 850 millibars, looks like about 65 knots there. So very favorable veering and strengthening of the winds with height, leading to these very intense wind profiles, strong curvature of the low levels of the hodograph. About 460 meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative velocity should foster a tornado threat with the storms along the dry line late Thursday night into Friday morning. Also could favor a hail threat initially with those storms, especially as they might be a little bit elevated to start, and then they'll become a little bit more surface-based as the moisture continues to stream northward, and we will see those storms become surface-based. The low levels, they'll tap into that low-level shear, and the tornado and damaging wind threat will increase going into Friday morning. Here we are a little bit farther to the south, much of the same. Instability here on this particular sounding, not quite as strong there in Louisiana. But that might just be a NAM quirk. This overall profile here, again, this was for southern Arkansas, looks pretty favorable for a robust severe threat. And we could see, depending on the size of this warm sector, some tendency for a discrete development out ahead of that main potential squall line as it moves off to the east. The NAM showing a little bit more of a pinched warm sector here, which is one of my concerns, at least potential drawbacks with this setup, is the overall size of the warm sector inland. This is not all that much real estate for there to be a lot of discrete supercells out ahead of this squall line as it moves off to the east. We'll have to watch that for sure. If we get a little bit larger of a warm sector here, then we'll have more real estate for those discrete supercells to work with, but not a ton here, especially with northward extent in this environment. We could see additional development down here coming off the Gulf in this strong warm advection regime, and that may allow for some supercells into Louisiana, Mississippi ahead of the squall line as it moves off to the east Friday morning into afternoon. But Friday afternoon is when we start to see that environment really start to intensify across the southeast. Again, the NAM not predicting much of a warm sector here going through at least late morning, early afternoon on Friday. Then we start to see a rapid transition of moisture inland across southeast Alabama into Georgia and the Carolinas. Much larger warm sector here. Here across, this looks to be that prefrontal dry line feature, warm front situated up in here, and this is plenty of real estate for now. Now this is at 0Z on Saturday, so 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday. Plenty of room for there to be discrete supercells out ahead of that line. The line should continue along that dry line, and we should have a renewed development on any confluence bands or prefrontal troughs out in the open warm sector. So This particular solution looks pretty favorable. Just for comparison's sake, let's take a look at the GFS depiction of the moisture. This is the 6Z GFS, and it's showing much of the same here. A little bit more of a pinched warm sector farther to the north, which is what we saw with our event on Monday. Tuesday, the inland extent of the warm sector was not all that great, and therefore we had a little bit more of a confined area for supercells here going into Friday morning, with the portion of the squall line inland as well as the discrete supercells as they moved into the Florida Panhandle, Georgia, southwest Georgia area. But north of that, it was tough to get surface destabilization. Those storms eventually outran the warm sector because of its kind of constricted size. Here, a lot of the same. But as we go into the afternoon on Friday, that warm sector starts to expand a little bit, quite a bit more, giving us more real estate across southeast Alabama, Georgia, and eventually into the Carolinas for a robust severe threat up there. And then the event should end sometime late Friday evening into Saturday morning as the cold front pushes offshore. So let's go back to the NAM, take a look at a couple of soundings here. We should see that environment, that strong environment for tornadic supercells maintain itself. As we'll see that those strong kinematics at play. So let's take a sounding here, 21Z, and we'll take a sounding here, southeast Alabama, out well into the open warm sector, and we'll see what happens there. And so at first glance, this might not look like a favorable setup for tornadic supercells. Instability a little on the weak side, and that may be just a NAM quirk here. I do expect there to be enough instability to support a severe threat with its activity, given strong low-level warm advection. Always have to worry about cloud cover in this scenario out in the open warm sector, possible showers and cloud cover out there, which may temper the instability a little bit. But assuming we'll have enough instability to work with, this wind profile maybe doesn't look like your prototypical tornadic supercell hodograph, but in the southeast, this more than works. We still see veering and strengthening winds with height. Southwesterly surface winds here, veering to west-southwesterly at about 850 millibars. So we do have enough low-level shear and curvature of those low-level hodographs to support storm rotation. And even though the low-level winds are quite veered here out of the southwest, we still have enough curvature in the hodograph to support tornadic supercells, and that low-level shear is quite strong, in excess of 300 meters squared per second squared, effective storm relative helicity. So as far as storm mode goes, as we saw, we should see a tendency for storms to be a little bit more discrete with this setup. Initiating boundary here, those shear vectors much more perpendicular to the initiating boundary, fostering maybe more of a broken line along the dry line, and then prefrontal confluence bands or prefrontal troughs in the open warm sector could foster discrete development as well. Let's look at that here right now. So this is our surface map. So our actual cold front is somewhere back in here, it looks like. Dry line feature in here along this pressure tongue feature. Possibly a little bit of a kink there along the warm front, as again, the warm sector is a little bit constricted at this time. We'll go to 0Z just to see. So here is our dry line. Warm sector extends over this way. Here's our warm front somewhere in there. Tough to see any kinks here in the surface pattern, maybe a little bit of kinkiness, if you will, in the open warm sector. Any of these little prefrontal troughs or confluence bands will have the potential to produce a little bit less forcing, a little bit more tendency for discrete storms out there in the open warm sector. We'll look at 850 millibar confluence bands here. Doesn't look like a whole lot in the warm sector. You don't see those streamlines coming together, something like that we might see with the confluence band at 850 millibars. So we'll just have to wait and see. We could see, again, in just the broad warm advection regime, any little subtle confluence bands may be just enough to provide the forcing for discrete supercells out in the open warm sector, which would have a significant tornado and damaging wind threat given the profiles we just saw. Let's take one more sounding here, 0Z, out as the warm sector increases in size and the kinematics increase in intensity. So this is at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, 7 p.m. Eastern. And that is certainly a favorable environment for tornadic supercells. Adequate instability, 1100 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, a little bit on the thin side, but that oftentimes doesn't matter a whole lot in the southeast. But that is certainly a favorable looking hodograph. Even though our surface winds, again, are veered a little bit, plenty of curvature there in the low-level hodographs as they veer and strengthen with height. over 400 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative felicity, strong deep layer shear for supercells in excess of 60 knots. So our kinematics here with this setup, once again, not going to be an issue. Thermodynamics may be an issue. We'll have to watch that for sure. I do think we'll see enough instability advect into the region, given strong low-level warm moist advection. And with this type of kinematic profile, that certainly would favor strong tornadoes, especially with any more discrete convection out in the open warm sector or a more broken line along the prefrontal dry line feature. And you see that warm sector continues off to the north a little bit, expanding into the Carolinas, going into the nighttime hours on Saturday. We'll take a sounding up here from South Carolina just to show that the environment will probably be favorable farther to the north as well. Certainly the case that those kinematics are pretty impressive, just like what we saw down to the south, maybe even a little bit stronger, closer to that low-level jet axis. And then the event will be ending from west to east as we go into the early morning hours on Saturday. We won't look at any convective allowing models here as they're just not quite far enough out yet, but that is kind of the conceptual idea for the upcoming couple of days. Again, slight risk level 2 out of 5, starting on Thursday evening going through Friday morning for parts of East Texas into the ArkLaTex and northern Louisiana, far western Mississippi. Potential for a band of storms, perhaps a more broken band given favorable shear vectors, with respect to the orientation of the initiating boundary along that dry line. Those will fire probably sometime as far west as the I-35 corridor, probably Dallas to Waco to the Red River, and move quickly eastward, and at which time they will intensify as that moisture continues to stream northward. Favorable environment for all severe hazards there. If the warm sector is broad enough, maybe some discrete development out ahead of that main band going toward eastern Louisiana into the Mississippi River Delta. But that is conditional at this point. Then we go into the Friday time frame, and that is when the event should peak as far as intensity goes. Enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 here from far southeast Alabama into Georgia and the Carolinas, as that warm sector will increase in size Friday afternoon, and the profiles will certainly favor a damaging wind and strong tornado threat. Potential for more discrete convection is definitely on the table. And as we know, discrete convection favors those long track, strong tornadoes, and certainly those will be favored in this type of kinematic environment. Still, some flies in the ointment remain as far as how the geometry of the warm sector looks for much of the day on Friday. It's going to remain, it looks at least on the models to remain a little bit more pinched with northern extent. And then it finally expands going into Friday afternoon. We'll have a much more real estate for those discrete supercells to traverse, going into, and that favorable environment will advect up into the Carolinas as well for a threat going into Friday evening. All severe hazards again on the table, with the long track strong tornado threat certainly there, as well as significant damaging winds. So if you live in any of these areas, be sure to keep those weather radios handy. Stay tuned to your local National Weather Service office for more information, as well as the Storm Prediction Center, and we'll get through this just fine. It's definitely been a busy busy week or so in the weather department. This is not all that uncommon, even for January. In these El Nino type years, when the jet stream is pretty powerful and relegated farther to the south, you'll get these frequent events along the Gulf Coast and eastern seaboard states, and that is what we've seen this year to start things off. I hope to maybe be back Thursday afternoon or evening with a video, but again, not sure given my travel schedule here the next couple of days. So if this is the only video, I will certainly be back with updates on the social media pages, post updates on the pages, both here on YouTube and my social media channels elsewhere. But we'll see if we can get another video in Thursday afternoon or evening as I get back to Oklahoma. Might be able to get a quick video up then, as the threat will still be a few hours off, starting on the evening hours on Thursday. So we'll see about that, but if this is the last video, definitely stay safe out there, and we will see you in the next one.